Okay, welcome everyone to the ICSEI 2020 Virtual Congress Symposium on Pracademia and Education. We're really thrilled to have all of our presenters here for the session across all different time zones and spaces. And to all of you who have sought us out and joined us for this session, we look forward to the discussion at the end. I'm Trista Hollweck, and with my colleagues Deb Nethalicki and Paul Campbell, who is unable to join us tonight, but Deb is here. You can see her on the gallery view. We're thrilled to be presenting part 2 of our Pracademia and Education spotlight session, really on what we think is an exciting special issue that will be coming soon. So I'm going to start with shoot, just one second. I'm going to stop my share because I forgot to share the sound. And I will do that. Okay. All right. So because we have Paul coming in from Hong Kong.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this ICSEI 2022 symposium on the special issue of the Journal of Professional Capital and Community that was focusing on the Pracademic and Pracademia. For those that have not had the chance to meet, my name is Paul Campbell. I'm Vice Principal of an international school here in Hong Kong, and until recently was a graduate student, doctoral student at the University of Glasgow, when I recently successfully defended my thesis just last month. I was a co-editor with both Trista and Deb of this special issue of the Journal of Professional Capital and Community, looking at Pracademia. And as much as I wanted to be with you all this evening, unfortunately, the time in Hong Kong is not very conducive to joining you live, which is why I'm making this brief recording at the start of the session. I just wanted to add a huge welcome and thank you for joining what I think is a really important symposium as part of ICSEI 2022, but also just to share a few insights on why personally I thought Pracademia and exploring the Pracademic as well was actually something that's so important, but also as part of an ongoing conversation, conceptualization, that is going to continue to be important as time and years go on, and why the conversation that hopefully we're going to be able to enjoy together today is so important. The special issue itself, I think, aimed to try to understand the complex interaction between people, places, spaces, and the communities that they're part of. People that negotiate and move between these spaces and places, build expertise and credentials in different communities, and how this is all utilised together with a focus on learning, with a focus on improvement, and a focus on change for learners, for communities, and for society overall. I think what this special issue does in itself, and each of the contributions that we'll hear a little bit more about in the session today, is about adding to the conceptualisation of Pracademia and the Pracademic itself. The special issue and the presentations offer some exemplification too of what this actually could look like and what this could mean. And I'm using the word could very intentionally because this is something that still needs further conceptualization and further definition to a degree as well. So what the contributions also offer are challenges about, well, what is the purpose and function of utilizing the concepts of the Pracademic, but also of Pracademia as a space or a place that could describe the places that individuals are operating within or between. It also problematizes some of the traditional notions that we have of how we demarcate and define some of the more traditional spaces that characterize our professional work and our membership of these different spaces as well, to help us start to understand the individuals, the groups, but also the communities and the work that happens that is not confined within the traditional parameters or spaces themselves that might characterize the work that we do, but actually starting to blend with or utilize or draw upon expertise, opportunities for knowledge mobilization, and opportunities for connection and collaboration that bring these spaces together or actually destroy these boundaries altogether and offer new opportunities for being together, for learning, but also for sharing and understanding things anew as well. I reached the end of my doctoral studies and beginning a new job in a new context, and having had this really exciting experience of being able to be a co-editor of this important special issue, I've reached the end of these processes still questioning what the function and purpose of Pracademia actually is, and even the label of the Pracademic. What I think remains, though, is the importance of the conversation that we're about to have today to help us understand, well, what are the possibilities of these concepts, these ideas, and these identities, and helping us understand not just the individual and the individual's interaction or movement across spaces and places, but actually how the insights that can be offered from that could illuminate new possibilities for how we learn, for how we share, and how we bring about improvements and change, not just within the context of schools and with education systems, but more broadly in society in the pursuit of something different and the pursuit of seeing something anew. So I'm really disappointed not to be joining the conversations today. I look forward to hearing more about it and to continuing this conversation, perhaps through subsequent special issues, but also through subsequent events through ICSEI and beyond. So enjoy the symposium, enjoy the discussions, and I look forward to following along afterwards as well. All the best.
Thanks, Paul. And I did put in a Learn Lab option for us. So I thought would be fun to just see for our the people that are here at the moment to think about what would be the, I think the question that I have here is, if I just get out, the questions I'm using is really what comes to mind when you hear the term Pracademia. So if you want to use it quickly, just I thought as the group, many of us have been thinking about this a lot and to see if we could come up with our own views. And I'm hoping that this code works. Of course, we'll see what happens in the next few minutes. Let me know if you've managed to get in. The code's at the top too, so 19, 15, 31. And as we're seeing these pop in, I mean, I think this was one of the concepts. This is our third symposium, really wrestling and grappling with the idea of Pracademia. And as Paul highlighted, it's still something that we continue to talk about and question and challenge and provide provocation for. So it's great seeing these different ideas coming in and populating, and I'll keep that open for now as we go. So as things come up as you're listening, it'd be great to add to. It would be a nice space to continue the conversation, and we can also put this out on Twitter, I think, as a follow-up. And so as I turn over to our presenters today, these are the contributors to the Pracademia special issue. And this year, we're really thrilled to have John and Michaela share first, and then Stephen and Keith, and then Scott. And unfortunately, Carol's unable to be here, but her afterward does offer some interesting challenge. And I look forward to having comments to see folk addressing and considering, you know, should there be a special issue or actually a journal of Pracademia? Who knows? What are the possibilities? So things to think about moving forward. And we had some guiding questions. And so these are for our attendees, just to let you know. These are the guiding questions that helped shape our special issues, and our presenters will be addressing these and more in their presentations. So I'm going to stop my share and pass on to, I think it's going to be John and Michaela.
Yep, so hopefully I'm going to start sharing with you as well. Can everybody see that okay? And hopefully it will start being actually a slideshow in a second. This is because Michaela left me to do the technical stuff again. When will she learn? Okay, can you see the slides as slides now?
Yep.
Because I can just see lots of floating heads, very disconcerting down the side. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our part of this presentation, part of this symposium. I'm presenting here from Scotland, where we had ice rain today. So those of you that are getting up early in the morning in slightly warmer countries, yes, you've got up early in the morning, but you didn't have to deal with ice rain. So it's always a positive in terms of many things that you've kind of going from as well. Kai and I are going to talk to you about invisibility within Pracademia in our session today. And this is something that came from the work that we did and from our paper that we to the special edition. In many senses, this is one of the notions that came from our conversations and from the work that we did. And it's something that we have been thinking about and something that we want to look into in more detail. And we asked the question, invisible identities, is this a problem for Pracademics or is this an advantage? And this is one of the things that we wrestled with, but didn't necessarily resolve through the work that we were doing in the paper. And therefore it needed further research and thinking. So what did we do? We went through the process of generating our research for the paper by undertaking qualitative reflective questionnaires undertaken by each other, asking our questions around the work that we did together as Pracademics back in 2018 through to the beginning of 2020. These were transcribed and turned into segmented episodes of our transcripts where we looked at them and coded them and thought about the different themes that we were discussing. And those were then enabled us to kind of consider the contradictions that were experienced about being a Pracademic. So we found that there were contradictions that we could resolve. And then as we resolved the contradictions, we generated new contradictions within our own practice, either internally within our own practitioner roles or our academic roles, or within the context in which we were working. So we might solve one problem and then generate a new problem that we then had to resolve in another way. And that process or that shared activity space that we lived within was this Pracademic identity space where we looked at what it meant to be a Pracademic within our context, but also what it meant to be a Pracademic more generally. And from that came these four themes of collaboration, purpose, integration, and time. One of the things that existed, one of the things that was interesting around those themes was within them was this notion of invisibility. So we went back and looked at the transcripts and we used situational analysis using Clark's maps to kind of draw out and think around what does this theme mean? What does this look like? And we use the maps in conjunction with memoing to kind of talk around what were these things meaning to us and where do we get to from our conversations and where do we need to explore this further? And in many senses, the presentation we're going to share with you today is going to leave you with more questions than answers and going to get you to think around what does invisibility mean to you as a Pracademic as much as what does invisibility mean to us? So we're looking at resonances that you might experience yourselves, but we're going to show you some of the things that we found as we went through. So here is an example of a very tidy, messy map. It has been tidied up for the purposes of the presentation. And in many senses, this was 3 maps that have been combined together just for ease so you can see them. So 3 things that kind of struck us as we were going through our work and thinking around invisibility and revisiting our transcripts were actually that invisibility was grouped into different things and meant different things at different points. Invisibility was around recognition. Were we being recognized? Were we not being recognized? Who was recognizing us? Where were they recognizing us? It was around enthusiasm. How were we feeling at the process? Were we feeling self-driven? Were we feeling like we could involve other people? Was our enthusiasm infectious or was it limiting? And freedom. Could we do what we wanted to do? Did we have to do what somebody else was telling us to do? Were we constrained by the academic model? Were we constrained by our practitioner roles? Or were we free from them by being able to transcend and cross boundaries? These are all kind of the things that emerged from our research. And just to give you some snippets of things that we talked about, when we were thinking about recognition, there was this part that came through that said, you know, we'd done this work together. And one of the things that was captured was, it's not just me standing up and presenting a science lesson. I can go and train other people. And I know actually how to do that because I've done it. And they believe that I can do it. So there's recognition that came from peers and colleagues around the expertise that was shared from being a Pracademic. But there was also on the flip side of that was this kind of this invisibility part of the process, which meant that we weren't recognized, that it was not seen to be our job. It was sometimes we felt like we were islands. We were trying to find ways to do everything ourselves, but it was really tiresome because no one was listening. We were like shouting into a void. And that was both in our practitioner space where our colleagues were like, well, why are you doing that? That's not in your job. But also in the academic space where people were like, well, you work in a school, get on with doing your job as a teacher, as opposed to thinking around the complexity of those parts. And in terms of freedom, one of the biggest conflicts there was that, you know, we had the freedom. I was the school leader, so we could do largely what we wanted to do. But within that, we actually had no power because we were dictated to in terms of what we needed to cover and how we were doing it. And another way of thinking around that was we had the freedom to challenge ourselves, but we didn't necessarily have somebody being that critical friend because they didn't understand what we were doing. And that brings us back to this kind of last notion around invisibility, which is sometimes it looks like you're doing nothing, but you're doing a lot, because you might be having lots of meetings, or you might be doing a lot of thinking or lots of preparation, but no one can see that work because it has no material identity. People sometimes assume you're not doing anything, and thus they can't see why you'd need time to do that. Thinking's not given time when you're in a busy primary school. You need to be teaching lessons or doing marking or completing assessments. You can't possibly be spending time reading or thinking. And so there's these notions around what is visible and what does visible things look like, and what's given credit or recognition, that became important to us. And I'm going to hand over to Kai now, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about some of this ordered thinking.
So I think when we first looked at invisibility, we were thinking about that it was all negative. And some of the things that came up made us think about the way that we worked in different ways, and positives did come from that. But from the negatives, the invisible workload, no one could see what we were doing. We seemed to be quite busy all the time, always having meetings, but we weren't ever given any time to really complete our lesson study work or our research. And it was felt that it really interfered with the rest of our job. So we could see, we were seen to be very busy, but we couldn't not have parents' evening, or not teach the curriculum, or make any real adjustments within our actual practice roles to facilitate our lesson study. And also we had a huge amount of reading in our extended preparation. We were spending most of our non-teaching hours reading and researching and trying to find our focuses for our lesson study, or bring things to the group. And that was definitely, I think, with the second lesson study, John and I put a huge amount of preparation in before, so that we had enough resources to bring to the group, so that it felt like a more cohesive and more organised lesson study. But nobody saw that. We presented to the group, we brought our papers for us to read and share, and it was all top loaded. So that was presented at the beginning of the group. I think also we weren't really leading on from that, given it any time to coordinate or prepare for our lesson study. Really, everything that we did was driven by enthusiasm. So because we really wanted to do it, we wanted to do a good job. It was a new thing that we were doing in the school for the first time in a few years. Everything we did was because we loved it. We really wanted to get something done, and we wanted to make something out of it. But no one could really, other than manipulating our timetables, which we had a little bit of flexibility with, more with the second lesson study, it couldn't detract from our practice roles at all as a class teacher. And also I felt, as at the time I was a science lead, so I was really, really focused on teaching the material we needed to get taught in the right time. We were getting to the end of the summer term, and part of me was very, very torn and thinking about, are we covering the content that we need to? Are the children doing all the learning that they need to? Because sometimes we had to step back and reteach a lesson. It didn't go as planned. And that caused quite a lot of conflict, particularly with me as the class teacher. And then the other thing from that is the isolation. So all of this work was invisible even to the other participants in the group, really. And as John said, we often felt like we were little islands just working separately on our project, that no one could really see at the time how that was going to benefit the school. And the lack of recognition comes from two sides, really. It comes from both our colleagues that we work with, but also when we're thinking about sharing our research, or having a network of people that we could go to and think about drawing ideas from them. And that was we felt quite isolated during that, during our lesson study time. John talked about, when we were doing our interviews, the fact that he was allowed to do the lesson study as long as it didn't interfere with his role as head teacher. But also it was those things where we were seen to be having meetings, and because people didn't know what we were doing, or they weren't interested at the time, then people would think we were just sitting in the office drinking tea. And there would always be some kind of organizational thing, or a behavior, or some kind of head teacher thing that would be trying to pull him away from that. So maintaining the focus of our lesson study was really quite difficult and only really maintained by our enthusiasm. But there were some positives, quite a few positives. So within the area of lack of recognition, we found that because no one was really interested in what we were doing initially, we were able to choose our own focus. As we moved on with our second lesson study cycle, it did become much more linked into the school priorities. But the first lesson study, we were able to change the focus as we went along. We began with the focus of improving presentation in books, and it really moved on to something entirely different by the time we got halfway through. We were thinking about thinking maps and drawing on other research, thinking about lesson structure. And because no one else was really involved in it at the time or wanted to be involved, it enabled us to have the freedom to kind of change it as we went along according to our own interests. And then also, as we began to share our work from the lesson study, our enthusiasm for it and the way that we showed that it was very developmental for all the members of the group kind of drew other people into the work. And so it actually became eventually, so it felt like we had a practice run. It eventually became, lesson study became part of our professional development cycle in the school. So by the time we'd kind of introduced other people to it, we had really thought about how we were going to facilitate lesson study in a more effective way. And it just enabled us to develop our work through our interest and other professional discussions that we had. But the main thing about it was there was no expectation of what work we produced or the quality of the work at the end, because it was we just kind of followed our interest and followed the changing lesson structure and our focus as we went along through the lesson study. So I think that was possibly made our first lesson study more positive and more developmental for me, because we were able to change it as we went along. And then within our practice roles, we were able to develop as practitioners. It made us think about how effective it is to plan a whole scheme of work, rather than just go lesson by lesson or just medium-term plan, actually thinking really carefully about how we would structure a whole scheme of work within a whole subject across a year group. And I think the biggest positive that came out of it was that I engaged for the first time in research and academic reading for the first time since I did my degree. And that really drove me into kind of new avenues and new interests, and enabled me to focus on the skills that I wanted to develop in the areas that we needed to as a team and as a school and personally.
So we're really going to sit on the fence at the end of this and say that it is both a problem and an advantage in terms of visibility. It's not something we should dismiss, because actually sometimes the advantages of being invisible mean that you can do things that you couldn't do if you were visible. So actually being able to control your own destiny and do the research you wanted to do is something that we don't always have the luxury to do. We also saw it from different points of view. And if going back to Knight's and Clark's kind of viewpoint of kind of the different ways you can be aspirant or extensionalist in terms of kind of the way you think about things. Actually, Kai and I view this from different perspectives. I'm much more thinking around how does this part link to the next thing that we're doing and where do we go with this journey? Whereas Kai's often thinking around what's the quality of this thing that we're producing, and is this going to help us actually develop where we are right now? And so actually, as Pracademics, we see things from different points of view, and we're not the same in terms of, even though we were there at the same time, the things that were important to us and things that were visible or invisible actually had different meanings for the two of us. And we only really discovered this by accident. This research itself was to explore what being a Pracademic was within lesson study, but actually what we found out was actually there's far more around our individual identities and also the processes of where we are now as Pracademics that came from this work and from the decisions that we made as we went through it. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I'm sorry that the screens were really small. I did see the chat halfway through and adjust them as I went through. It's to do with presenter mode being in different places. I'll stop sharing now.
That's great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And have a look at the chat. Yep, lots of claps here, the silent. Lots of great stuff in the chat to continue the conversation as we move on to our next presenter. So Stephen and Keith.
All right, how are we all doing on the various time zones that we're in? Our little session as it loads in. Let me know if you're getting black bars down the side, because I noticed that on Trista's. But anyway, so we're talking about education-focused Pracademics on Twitter, building democratic fora. So this is our paper in the special issue, of course. I'm speaking as a teacher. Keith is joining us as an early career researcher. And I don't know, a late career teacher, being in it for 12 years. That's embarrassing to say, because teaching dies out quickly. We're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people here. We recognise elders past, present and emerging. This quote I recently enjoyed just yesterday, actually, from Deb's new book. Teachers interact with one another, but these interactions are often only tangentially about teaching. These relationships solidify the status quo as teachers and leaders reinforce each other's points of view about teaching. And I don't know why I read that out. Normally I would not, but this relates to me massively, because there's so many conversations I have with teachers where we never mention teaching and we never actually engage with the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. Lots of other conversations, but none of necessary the import that I seek in my professional work, which brings us to the idea of professional development. And so, at least for teacher professional development, it's all, it's a shotgun, it's fly in, fly out, it's expensive, it's one-off, it's, large auditoriums full of hundreds of people, it's not ongoing, and it's, a whole range of problems, time consuming, all these sort of things. We all know, I imagine, we all have a really good idea of some of the issues happening there. And then of course, there's a lot of, so expensive as we enjoy this conference ourselves. And then of course there's social media, and there's many people proposing that social media is the solution. But of course you see little buy-in, you often see quite high sort of activation and engagement, but it's very shallow and sort of front facing. So people are sort of aware of what they're sharing, and no one's ever going to stand up in various social media spaces and say, hey, I had a bad lesson. I remain a terrible teacher. This class is a real struggle. As John was saying, the rain, snow was coming in the window, but we have to keep them open for COVID. No one's going to be out there saying those sort of things. And this is kind of the other end of the invisibility spectrum. They were talking about ice, like rain, snow. I don't know. We don't have that down here. So, but yeah, they're kind of the opposite side of the invisibility. The social media aspect is the opposite. You're trying to be visible at all times, but never honest, perhaps. So yeah, when it comes to social media, there's often, similar to the quote that began the presentation, there's not that much actual engagement with teaching itself. And there's a long tail with limited autonomy and interaction from most participants. It basically means, most people just jump in and jump off and don't engage in an ongoing way, form those networks and connections that we value here. A lot of people talking past each other, little academic involvement, because it's often sort of, sharing work and then withdrawing. And we talk about the idea of context collapse, which is, I say, well, my class is really struggling, and there's 25 of them, and then someone else is thinking of, from their kindergarten experience, from their academic experience, teaching a room full of students, hundreds of students versus my 25, and I'm saying relationships are key, and other people in a different context are assuming their context, and thus many issues emerge as a result of that. So our paper focused on this stupid idea that I came up with in September 18th of 2018, basically an academic reading group. And since then, we've been running we're up to our 31st article coming in February. So we've been running for a fairly long time, and there's been a lot of engagement. Wow, how exciting. And so basically, just to give you an idea of what that is before we sort of jump in, 2018, I know, it mentioned Skype, like what is that? I can't remember the last time anyone mentioned that out loud, but here we are. Anyway, so EduReading is a monthly reading group. We do it on Twitter and Flipgrid. Flipgrid is a video sharing platform. It's international in scope, largely Anglophone at the moment, but we're sort of working on it. But, you know, it's popular, I feel, comparatively. We do one article a month, and then people provide video responses on Flipgrid, and then we have a big Twitter chat for an hour that ideally is informed by all the discussions that have taken place via the video format. So it gets richer than just sort of, you know, we're talking about coaching, and question 1 is what is coaching, and question 2 is do you do coaching? You know, that's quite common on social media, those sort of discussions, where it's almost definitional. But because we've read a rigorous academic article, not a summary, not a meta-analysis, an actual article, we've discussed it, people have had ongoing discussions throughout the month, then we turn that into a much more sort of fine-grained discussion. And we've talked about a whole bunch of ideas, and the idea is shifting from just consuming knowledge to relating it to people's context. So the idea would be, you know, you read an article and you say, well, this doesn't fit in my context, and kind of the idea that context is king, bringing that back into the discussion. We set this up as a democratic fora, space between the professional practice and educational research. And this is something we think is new, even based in comparison to traditional professional development and social media professional development as well. So Keith, you want to jump in here? Or you want me to keep pressing on?
No, you go, Steve. You've got it all under control.
All right, cool. Basically, the theory we tried to, we looked at it autoethnographically. So Keith and myself sort of did a bit of self-reflection on how we engage with the process, how it fit with our identity, our professional work, and so on. And we used the idea of the Pracademic to sort of see, you know, how comfortable we felt with the concept. And then our ongoing research will be looking at how other participants in the group, whether they identify as Pracademics or not, or whether they think that has value or not, and so on and so forth. So a lot of identity work, and yeah, following on from John and Michaela, the idea of, yeah, the identity, the value of it, where it's valued, where it's not, and so forth. And so we were basically looking at it from different perspectives. For the, you know, for the content of this presentation, we're keeping it focused on teachers for issues of time, I guess. But Keith was also looking at kind of the publish or perish idea for his own work as well, and how that, you know, informs or doesn't inform engagement with social media PL of this kind. So our research questions were, what features are sort of unique or distinct of this particular space? And do the affordance of social media allow Pracademics to sort of empower themselves, to show autonomy, and to kind of be leaders in that space? So as I said, autoethnographic, Keith and myself were the researchers and the participants, and we developed a bit of a case study of edu reading that, as I said, we continue to explore, and I'll post, you know, the articles themselves in the chat for those who haven't come across them. And so the results and findings, basically, we found that there was more rigor and depth, in the sense that the sort of barrier for entry is higher. Your average Twitter chat, you know, or social media engagement just involves you logging in and typing some characters, but this involves actually doing some research, some reading, some homework, which is, as far as I know, unheard of, which, you know, for obvious reasons, I guess. It's very accessible. You don't need to pay anything or do anything, but there is, as I said, that bar of entry. And the idea is that we're creating new knowledge. So, you know, getting a primary school teacher to engage with, you know, David Nichols' internal feedback model, you know, that's new knowledge that hasn't been done before. And collaboration, obviously it's collaborative, and most importantly, it's beyond cultural context. So, you know, in a forum like this, it's common to be watching people and learning from people across nations, but that's not entirely common for your average teacher. And I'm very much an average teacher as well. But, you know, I've learned a lot about the French education system and the UK education system and Ofsted and all these sort of things that I may have read about, but they don't necessarily have that link until I'm actually collaborating with these people with these connections. And so basically, in reference to the conference theme, we think this is social media that allows for greater equity. People globally, if you don't have good sort of support, professional learning where you're at, then this is an alternative. We think it helps bridge the gap, and I'm sure Scott will speak to that as well, following us, between teachers and academics, and the sort of the ivory tower and all those sort of metaphors that are so commonly accepted. And I guess it focuses on autonomy. So teachers opt in and opt out in their own way. And we think it might be a remedy for some of the ongoing training of teachers, especially experienced teachers, where it sort of tends to kind of disappear and fade away. You know, you're experienced now, you're on your own, good luck. Maybe do some PLCs or PLTs or some sort of collaborative learning, but that's sort of the extent of it. So that is us, and I'll be reading the chat and typing my little heart out. Thank you. Oh yeah, last thing, call to action. Do other people think there are other social media learning networks that can support teacher professionalism? And do Pracademics offer the possibilities for reifying teacher professionalism? It's sort of the ongoing question. Of course, we're always open for people to get involved in the project, provide an article, take part in the group, you know, assist us in the researching of it. All these things are sort of things that we would love to explore with other people. So cheers, and thanks, Keith.
Great call to action. And as we move towards, what we're going to do, we had talked a little bit about having a chance to ask questions, but if you could put the questions in the chats, then that would be helpful. And then we'll have Scott present, and we can use our extra time or remaining time to respond together as a group.
Am I unmuted now? Yeah, so apart from swearing, hopefully that didn't get caught because my unmute actually disappeared once I started sharing screen. I am going to try to pick up on a bunch of the stuff that we've heard so far. I'm going to try to do it a lot more shooting from the hip, actually, because I'm probably even going to stray from my own slides, because I've got a whole bunch of notes from listening to everybody doing this today, and I'm going to endeavour to do it as quick as possible. And one of the great things I love about sharing this screen is how all the floating heads actually come up over part of my slide, which is just awesome. But I'm going to try to look at some of the problems and possibilities of Pracademia, and I come from a very different space because I don't identify as a Pracademic, and I work in a university, and I'm not even early career because I'm a full professor. Like, so it's a different sort of lens that I'm hopefully trying to bring to this, but it is something that I would say that I've been spending a lot of time, and I'll give a well, it's to Paul and Trista as well, but primarily give a hat tip to Deb for this one, who has really had me thinking about this idea of Pracademia and the Pracademic over a number of years here, and listening to everyone today has been fascinating. And that's why I'm probably going to stray from my slides with all these extra notes I've got on the side. And I will note that Stephen was very humble then and just said he's just an average teacher. But as you would have seen from his last slide, he was in the top 50 of the Global Teacher Award this year. So I don't know if there ever is just an average teacher. And humility is one of those interesting things that comes up as we're thinking about Pracademia and Pracademic. The paper I wrote, you know, there's a reference for the paper that I wrote. It's a different take. It's a different take on it. But one of the things that I've really been trying to think through and engaging with Deb, Trista, and Paul over this has really got me trying to dig down to what are some of the underlying assumptions of Pracademia and the Pracademic, and what do I see at least as some of the intentions of that work and what that means. So yeah, I'm actually even going to stray from the paper because it's further thought. So some of the assumptions that I've come up with in trying to think through this is all fields, but particularly education and arguably the professions in general, really do need diverse contributors to their knowledge dynamic. There is a need to have people coming together from diverse, not just diverse perspectives, but actually also diverse roles. And I think that's one of the things that's really jumped out around the Pracademia movement. It's about bringing people from different roles together, or that's what I see as some of the intent. And one of the things, if I'm trying to think through in educational leadership specifically, you know, there's always been clinical faculty or contingent faculty. You know, that's been part of universities, like having school-based or system-based people teaching into programs and vice versa. Not that I'm trying to defend educational leadership programs, but it is something that's quite common there. And you will note that a number of my pictures, for those of you who've never visited UNSW, a number of my pictures are trying to showcase our lovely campus. Our campus is on Gadigal country which is part of the Eora Nation, which is in the Sydney Basin. But I, of course, am coming to you today from a Wabikal country, which is north of Newcastle. It's not quite rainy, like Keith said, down in Sydney. We are overcast, but it's not too bad here. But understanding where we are is central. So when we do acknowledgement of country, it's actually about acknowledging traditional owners of the land and things that have taken place in country and understanding those histories that are going forward. And I think that's part of actually understanding Pracademia and the Pracademic as well, is trying to understand fields and field locations as we're going forward. So one of the things that I think is really important as we try to come together is to actually think through, this is a very text heavy slide, so apologies for that. It's primarily to keep me on track. It is, even though I know the Pracademic is part of the Pracademia discussion, I think we can't necessarily conflate the two, because Pracademia actually does this work around that professional practice and academia, hence Pracademia, practice and academia coming together. But that's about professional practice and academia. It's not about theory and practice. It's not about research and practice. It's about professional practice and academia. And I think that's a really interesting space. And there's a lot of parts that actually engage with this stuff. The Pracademic, as in the individual, is an interesting one, because it is about identity work. And I think that's a really interesting space to actually think through around how do we bring people together, but then also do this individual identity work? How do we grapple with these internal tensions of recognising spaces without necessarily idolising individuals within those spaces? How do we actually do some of that work? And that's something that's had me interested. And I arguably spend way too much time in the paper trying to do this sort of nuance around what it means. What it means, what does it mean? It's good when you also preempt your own argument. So one of the things that Andy Hargraves talks about this spanning the worlds of research and practice. As I said there, notice the shift. It's reduced to research and practice, not that academia and practice, because that actually shifts the location. Engagement with research, all the presentations we've heard today are actually people engaged in schools or the academy, engaging with research in their practice. Many people do already engage in this research and practice. That's different to academia and practice, and that I think actually matters. Because what I think is actually underlying some of this work is this idea of what type of knowledge is being generated, where is that knowledge being generated, and what does that mean for expertise in the field? Who actually has these claims to expertise, and how do we develop as a field? How do we actually develop the highest quality research and understandings? I'm privileging research by saying research there, but how do we actually develop the greatest quality, the highest quality of knowledge to advance practice? And who does that? How do we do that? And what I see sometimes coming out in these discussions, and one of the questions, I can't remember who posted it, but about, I think it might have been John, around who would identify as a Pracademic and Pracademia, and some of these things are quite interesting around, are we just rehearsing old arguments around theory and practice? And as Stephen hinted at, that sort of ivory tower, you're off doing that sort of work there. Or, I'm practical, my wife, what's my wife going to use in her class on Monday morning type stuff? How do we actually make sure that discussions around Pracademia and the Pracademic go beyond just this sort of theory and practice and these divisions? Because if it doesn't do that work, and I'm not convinced it does this work all the time, although I'm not against it at the same time, but it can be quite divisive. And I think Keith mentioned this in the chat as well. So this idea of theory and practice and the Pracademic who works across both does establish somewhat of a hierarchy in there. And I do spend time, and I know most Pracademics or most people who identify as Pracademics absolutely hate that argument, but it is something that I think needs to be engaged with. And I know we talk about identity work and people struggling, and trying to think through this identity. I must admit, I was a little bit reluctant at times to actually engage with this symposium and to engage with the special issue as well, because there is a challenge with engaging with this space and the hierarchies and all that in there, and whether they're intended or not, but they do actually start to come out there. And I think part of this is making sure we're discussing the ideas and what are the assumptions behind Pracademia and the Pracademic, not necessarily the Pracademic and that individualised, that naming, the sort of thing. How do we do that? And I think this is where the slippages in language actually matter. So if we're talking about Pracademia, that coming together of the academy and practice, that's different to the coming together of research and practice, or theory and practice. And I think those types of things matter, because the idea of the Pracademic, which is becoming increasingly popular, can be quite divisive. And of course, who gets to count as a Pracademic? Because I work in a university. I used to work in schools. I do a lot of work with systems. I visit schools. I work with principals groups and stuff like that. I'm married to a teacher. My children go to school. Am I a Pracademic? No, I don't think so. I'm just an academic doing my job. Do I think people in schools know what academics have to do? No. Do I think people in the academy know exactly what people in schools have to do? No. How do we actually get us to start to come together? And I'm not sure a label necessarily helps us with that. And this is actually just outside my office, this lovely tree. So why does this actually start to matter? And hopefully I'm sticking to time for you, Trista, but I think one of the interesting challenges, one of the tensions and pressures that comes up around Pracademia and Pracademic is, how do we actually support diverse voices? How do we make sure, arguably this group today, all 17 or 15 of us, are arguably already converted to some extent? How do we actually make sure that we're supporting, encouraging, and including diverse voices in all of the work that we do? So we are actually not just breaking down boundaries, but we're actually blurring those boundaries and where they were to begin with. How do we make sure that we're actually talking about ideas? So it's not just about personal branding or privileging whether ideas came from universities or in schools. How do we actually get the best ideas that we can? How do we get the best ideas for education? Part of that does involve challenging assumptions often, and that works in all directions. Sometimes we actually need to think back at what are the assumptions that we're bringing to these terms that we're using and why do they matter? But ultimately, despite my paper possibly being considered a critique of Pracademia and Pracademic, and even my presentation today possibly doing that, I actually think that the intent, when I listen to Trista or Paul or Deb or anyone else, all of our wonderful presentations today, part of me thinks the intent of this movement, the intent of this work, is actually bringing people together in conversation to do that work around that co-construction, that co-design of knowledge. How do we make sure that we're actually focusing on learning, improving, moving forward, and actually doing that thing? And in wrapping up, I'd go back to this. There's work from Michael Oldfield. It's in like the 1950s, if not earlier, and he talks about the purpose of education. And he talks about that idea of being to join the conversation of, and he called it mankind, but if we call it the conversation of the world, as I appropriate it, I actually think the idea of the Pracademic is about that. It's about bringing people together in conversation, and it's a conversation that's larger than what they might be able to do themselves or what they might be able to do with colleagues in the same role as them. It's actually about bringing people into conversation with as many diverse voices as possible so that we can understand what work we do and why it's important. And you've got my contact details, that's fine. So thank you very much. Over to you, Trista.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our presenters. This has been a really great way to see what I've read come alive and see what really is important to each of the presenters. I put in the chat, but access to all the early site. And then please reach out if you can't access it. One of the challenges of working in schools and not being in academia is paywalls. So if you are having trouble accessing some of these articles, please reach out and we'll send you a copy. And I'm going to pass it over to Deb to lead us into a conversation. So I'm just going to actually, Deb, do you want to spotlight or do you want to?
No, because we'll have a discussion. So just. Okay. This is in a gallery. No one needs to see my face too big. It's at now 5 a.m. I just took a few notes as people were talking. Thank you so much to the presenters for their papers, but also for the discussion today. John and Michaela, those ideas of time, value, recognition, and I think anyone who's been in kind of multiple roles or in a school doing research work on the side would resonate with that idea that it's maintained entirely by enthusiasm of the individual. And I think something that will resonate with people and that's worth thinking about is that notion that you talked about of the invisibility. And I think that probably is something to think about across spaces, because I see Scott and I've talked a little bit about sometimes in the academy there's some work that's more and less visible or more and less valued, and same in schools and possibly also in policy work. So I think one of the challenges when we think about Pracademia, and we think about, I absolutely agree with what Scott said at the end there about, for me, the possibilities of Pracademia around bringing people and diverse voices together in conversation for the better of education, for the better of students. And that as we're sort of, you know, blurring or exploring what might be perceived boundaries, or might be ways of being and identities and practices that are perhaps pushing the boundaries of what is expected within, you know, our day jobs, and building spaces between networks and collaborations. I think that's where the possibilities are, but there's certainly challenges. And I liked what Steve and Keith had to say, especially about Pracademia, or spaces between and across, as being possibilities for equity and moving beyond your own local and cultural context. And something that came up in the chat bar, I guess, that I wanted to throw out to the group was, it came up earlier on about teacher workload. Scott, I think you might have mentioned that, and Keith, you were talking about professionalism of teachers and what's been happening over the last, you know, 18 or so months with the pandemic, in terms of where the teaching profession and even potentially the academy has been, in terms of how have our engagements with each other or our practice changed? Have we been retreating into our more expected ways of being and doing, or have we been moving out beyond that and connecting more together? So I thought that was the question that really struck me as we worked through. But there's also plenty there. I know, John, I can see in the chat bar you're also talking about responding to that idea from Scott about the fact that that identity and Pracademic and Pracademia needs some exploration of that conversation, and that exploration is worth having. So I'm going to stop talking, just open it up to anyone who's willing to respond to any of those comments or questions or things that have come up for you during the presentation today.
I just wanted to expand on the idea of identity, and kind of, I suppose, as a Pracademic, I've been in two different situations, and maybe Trista has some resonance with this as well, because I know that she's a Pracademic in different spaces. So having been a head teacher who was involved in kind of being a Pracademic within the school and kind of that process, then moving into teacher education and expecting it to be very different, but actually those notions of invisibility still being very much the same, that we're not considered to be academics because we're not on research contracts, but we're not considered to be teachers anymore because we don't work in schools, yet we still have multiple aspects of both those roles. And so it's really interesting, kind of this hidden land between the two places. And Michaela and I spoke to the rest of my team around that in terms of table the notion of a Pracademic, and it was interesting just kind of talking to them afterwards about whether they felt that resonated with them, and they were very conflicted about whether they could claim either space, because they're told when they move into teacher education roles they're no longer teachers and teachers won't listen to them because they're not teachers anymore, but they also can't be academics because they're not doing research in the way academics do it. So I wonder if there are different ways of seeing Pracademics, and I know that Joe mentioned this in the chat around GPs doing things here in Scotland as well, that actually there are these kind of all these different groups where these people exist that are pushed towards an edge of a boundary or have moved from one setting to another, that feel like they lose their identity, but actually maybe the Pracademic identity is more embracing than we think it is.
Thanks, John. And Keith, you wanted to jump in there with something?
I did put up my hand, but I'm not sure. I'll say it anyway, and you know, throw it out there in the spirit of the conversation. I'm intrigued at the notion of definitional clarity about what it means to be Pracademic, or as Scott said, the difference between being part of Pracademia and a Pracademic. And I'm wondering if perhaps we're pursuing this need for clarity of a definition too much, and maybe this is what I think John was saying in the chat about how we're moving towards different definitions in different contexts. You know, it's that old nailing jelly to the wall kind of problem, that there's going to be different so maybe we need to become more comfortable with an ambiguity regarding what a Pracademic or even what Pracademia might look like. But yeah, the central thing for me that I see is so powerful in the work that Stephen and I have been doing related to this is this opportunity to escape from what I see as an increasingly instrumental, top-down, deterministic approach to teacher practice and education, which I don't think works in every context, and I'm not even convinced it works in most contexts. So moving away from this notion, and I think this is where my interest in Pracademia fits in, moving away from this there is only one way to teach and it will work in every single kind of context, towards a more nuanced professional understanding that there are different things. And I think there is a role for a Pracademic within that space. But I think, what is that space? Because I think social media really is one way that provides a space. It doesn't necessitate it, but it provides a space where we can communicate with diverse groups in different ways, more so than we've ever been able to do before. But just providing that space doesn't necessarily mean those conversations are going to happen. They need to be managed. They need to be structured. So I think we're kind of, we're starting to explore these areas. But I think there's lots to be done, as your own work obviously is leading the charge. Anyway, okay, sorry, that was a bit rambly.
Thanks, Keith. Does anyone else want to pop in? Anyone who's a participant or a presenter can pop in to the discussion. We've got maybe room for one more, Trista.
Just to say thank you so much. I am, sorry, it's the cat. I am new to the term Pracademia. I just popped along today to find out more about it, because in my university in Glasgow, we support teachers in schools to use their own data and to create research projects. And I was wondering if Pracademia would be something that would align to the kind of work that we do. But hearing about it, I was reminded of work I've done in the past around GPs and some of my colleagues that have moved into that liminal space of being a lecturer while also maintaining this role as a GP and using their data in their practice, but then using their practice to actually guide what they research. So it's been a really illuminating hour, and I've really enjoyed all the papers. So thank you so much. The cat's now going.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm happy to jump in. I think that's the goal, like for it to be, for Pracademia or Pracademic work to be something that's actually recognized or valued or encouraged, I guess. Like from my experience anyway, as a high school teacher, research is something that's, spoken about, but not actually read. It's the royal research. Well, research says, and, if you ask for a reference list, there's never one forthcoming. But to make that transition from sort of the things that many of us do sort of in I think it was Deb who said, our day job. So this is our night job, I assume, or our morning job in Deb's case, because it's 4 o'clock where she is. But yeah, for that to be, valued, or to be something that's, perhaps paid for, well, heaven forbid. So kind of, I think we're trying to lay the groundwork for that to be a possibility and something that's supported, and, maybe other systems other than Australia are doing it much better, but I'd be interested to hear if that's the case, because it's not great from my viewpoint where we're at.
Deb, did you want me to go ahead? You got it.
You wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Trista, you wrap us up.
Oh, well, just a huge thanks. And I loved in the comments the suggestion of a teach meet and, connecting people. But this to me is a really amazing opportunity to see the faces of people. We've read your work. We've seen some new members join us in the conversation. We keep hoping it'll continue to be a contribution, that there'll be a next step, and that check out all of the different Twitter. If you do the hashtag Pracademia, there are often Twitter chats that dig into some of these ideas and the work. I know Stephen and Keith have done a few pieces around this, and I know there are conversations in other areas as well. So let's keep the conversation going. Wouldn't it be amazing to be a professor of Pracademia someday? And we'll see what that means, if anything. But it's been an absolute joy. Thank you all for coming, and I'll stay on if anyone wants to chat a little after. But enjoy the rest of ICSEI 2022. See you soon.